So today we're going to be going over how to solder Kailh Hotswap sockets as well as SMD diodes as basically and quickly as possible with the same equipment that you'd use for through-hole soldering. Now here we have our solder, our tweezers, very important for handling those small tiny little SMD diodes, our soldering station, as well as a fan for taking care of those fumes that tend to come off while you're soldering. Now doing this kind of soldering for the first time can seem very intimidating, but I'm going to show you it's not quite as scary as it might seem, though it does take some focus and you want to make sure you take your time with it. But before we really dive into that, let's go ahead and take a look at what solder we're using and how we're setting up our soldering station. So what we have here is just some basic rosin cord solder. It's the 6040 variety. That's definitely the kind you want to be looking at. I have 0.6, 0.7 is also fine. Now, this is leaded solder, so you have to be kind of careful with what happens with those fumes. Now, you can go for the non-leaded. It is a little more finicky to work with, but that's also a good option. But this is what we're going to be using today. Now, here's the soldering station we're going to be using. It's a cheap one I got off Amazon. That blue and yellow Hakko soldering station is probably a lot better one to use. However, this is one that my cheap self bought. Now, when setting up your soldering station, you want to make sure that the temperatures you're setting it at are between 350 and 390 degrees. Now this one, probably because it's cheap, tends to run a little cool, I find. So I tend to bump that up to 410 degrees. That allows the solder to melt pretty quickly without me having to leave the soldering iron on the pads for too long. Generally, you only want the soldering iron to be touching that pad for a few seconds. You can push it if you want to, but to be safe, that's the general advice for that. You also want to make sure that you have some way of storing these components. While the hot swap sockets aren't too small, the little SMD diodes are tiny. So I usually want to make sure that I'm very carefully opening up the packaging they're in and then putting them in something like a little lid. I use the lid for the tip cleaner that comes with the soldering station that I have. Now let's actually get to attaching that SMD diode to the PCB. I like to first start off by adding a little bit of solder to one of the pads. Now you don't have to paint the thing in flux. We were using rosin cord solder that's already pretty much taken care of. And you want to make sure you're using the least amount of solder possible. Unlike what I'm doing here, because I'm reaching around a camera and a tripod. Now, orientation of that diode does matter. You'll notice right here, as we zoom in, that there's a line on the top of that diode and a line on the PCB. Make sure that lines up. Take your time. Check that every single time. Make sure you're doing this in a well-lit area. You don't want your keyboard working because you messed one of these up or a few of them. Now, once we have the diode, go ahead and melt that glob of solder we just put on there and kind of slide into position. This is not a good example. Again, reaching around a tripod. My face is usually a lot closer. And then once it's where we want it, we'll heat up the other pad and solder the other leg onto that pad. And that's kind of all there is to it. Now this is ugly. I'm going to show you what it should look like here right now. Oh yeah, that's a lot better. Still a little heavy on the solder, but better than what you just saw there. And while you're doing this, make sure you're taking your time. Take breaks. Walk away from a while, do half the board, then come back. You'll be happy that you did. Now we're going to finish up by soldering on that Kailh Hotswap socket onto the PCB. A lot easier than the SMD diode because you can just kind of stick it onto the board. And I always start off by putting some solder on one of the pads. Now I take that Hotswap socket, I plug it in there. I'm going to take my tweezers and put some downward force on it and heat up that socket where I have the solder until it's been attached, and then come over to the other side and just kind of repeat the process. Now I am going to go back and kind of flatten these out a little bit. Pushing down on the socket, and there we go. And this is what it should look like once you're done. And that's all there is to it. And now you only have to do it many more times until you have a complete keyboard. Have a great rest of your day.